My name is Gretchen Schubeck, and I have the great privilege of being the Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Novato. Welcome to Novato and to the magnificent Buck Institute. Isn't this place crazy? Yeah. Before I introduce our amazing mayor, I want to give a shout out to the alternative commuters who absolutely rocked it today. That would be Renee Goddard and Jennifer Hammond from Fairfax, who rode their bikes up the hill. Right? I felt like that couldn't go unnoticed. So Renee and Jennifer, you rule. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce the mayor of Novato, Josh Fryday.
Thank you, Gretchen. Welcome, everyone, to Novato. How about a big hand for Gretchen and her amazing work? I want to welcome you all here to, as Gretchen said, this amazing, amazing place. And I want to first off thank our staff who made this all possible, Gretchen, especially you, and putting your heart and soul into today. I'm going to commit what is probably the worst possible political faux pas you could commit, which is not announce every single elected official's name in the room, and not announce every dignitary, because the reality is that this whole room is filled with leaders from around the entire North Bay. And that's why you were invited here today, and that's why this event and this conversation today is going to be so special. So we are all honored to have you all here today at the Buck Institute, one of the gems of Novato, which is not a coincidence, is home to the largest solar facility in Marin County. So make sure you get a chance to acknowledge that and go out and look at the solar facility out there, and we're very proud about that. But over the last couple of years, like many of you in this room, the Novato City Council has really recognized the urgency of this moment and has prioritized the importance of climate action at the local level. And I could take probably the next, hour or so talking about all the different things that we've done in Novato that I'm so proud of, whether it's the fact that we've committed to 100% clean energy, or the fact that we've changed all of our LED light bulbs, or all of our street light bulbs to LED, or we've hired a full-time sustainability and climate officer. But the reality is all of us, no matter where we are throughout the state, if we were giving a talk around the country, could brag about what the North Bay has done to lead on sustainability and the action that we have all collectively taken. But if there's ever an issue that highlighted both the interconnectedness and the interdependence of our communities, it's climate change. And we know that here in Novato, we can't be successful in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions without working hand in hand with agencies across the region. We know that we can't hit our climate action goals without partnering in a very meaningful way with nonprofits and with businesses and other organizations. And most importantly, we know that we have so much to learn from each and every single one of you who are experts in your own field about what is working, what is not working, what we should be trying, what we should be testing, and how we could push ourselves to be better, to be smarter. And that is really the purpose and the goal of today, that we can all be here together to learn from each other. And today, I would argue, is in many ways already a success, simply by the fact that we're all in this room together, ready and eager to talk to each other, and most importantly, to help each other. And now, of course, we're not going to solve every single problem today, but we will advance our work, and we will come out with progress that we can be proud of. We are all here today because we understand that we have an obligation not just to our children, but to our grandchildren to tackle this issue. And today we have an opportunity throughout the whole day with everything that's been planned, we hope, to not just inspire, not just energize each other, which I hope we do, but to take the opportunity to really roll up our sleeves, to ask the hard questions, to share best practices, and to do the fun work of figuring out how do we increase our collaboration and our coordination of all of our efforts to make sure that all of us succeed. Because really, as we all know, which is why you're here today, we have no option. Our communities are counting on us to succeed and succeed together. So in addition to our great staff, which I've already talked about, and the great agenda and conversation we're going to have today, I also want to thank a few of our sponsors for making today possible. First, we have Marin Clean Energy. Thank you for sponsoring our lunch and our appetizers. To Ultragenics, one of our great local companies, for sponsoring breakfast. Cliff Bar for sponsoring our reception later today, as well as 37 Wines, Mantra Wines, Trek Wines, and Adobe Creek Brewing Company for their support, which means if you stay till 4, you're not going to go home thirsty. We promise that. And of course, want to thank the Buck Institute and Eric Verdon for opening up their arms to invite us all in today to have this important conversation and be a community leader. So now, before we get started, everyone knows that there's really only one appropriate way for us to start a North Bay Climate Summit. And that is by honoring and listening to and learning from what I would call the patriarch of climate action in the North Bay, and probably the entire country, Congressman Jared Huffman. Congressman Huffman has led on the issues we're going to be talking about today for a long, and Jared, I'm not trying to make you feel old, but for a long time before these issues were cool and mainstream. And he has also inspired many of us and guided many of us on what it means to be a true leader and an environmental steward. And in my own life, when I was running Next Gen for Tom Steyer, Congressman Huffman encouraged me to get involved locally, to run for office, and make a difference where it counts, on the ground. His actions and leadership exemplify what it means to stand up time and time again on our values and do the hard work that actually makes an impact. Jared is a national leader, not just because he is passionate and knowledgeable and effective in protecting our environment, but he brings people together and he makes them better. So to bring us together and make us together, make us better, I welcome Congressman Jared Huffman.
Thank you.
Have fun.
I appreciate it. Wow. I have been called a lot of things, but I don't think I've ever been called a patriarch. The only I do feel old, and the only consolation I have is that I know in this room there's some graybeards who remember when I was the 30-year-old running for the Marin Water Board not that long ago. So, Josh, I'm impressed with the youthful energy that you and many others are bringing to this conversation, and also great that we have a multi-generational team here working together. I guess your program lists me as the keynote. I think that's a little oversold. Because I think the essence of what you're doing here today comes after me in the program, when you're going to hear about all of these amazing action plans, when you're going to hear about the leadership from local government, from businesses, from the nonprofit community here in the North Bay. That to me is the real essence of what is going on here, and it's pretty exciting stuff. And in some ways, the comments that I'm going to provide you with have the potential to challenge you in moving forward those actions, because as you're about to see, my report from Washington is fairly bleak. Okay, my hope is that instead of responding to what I have to say with despair, because that's not very productive, that you will look at it in this context as you talk about all the great things that are going on here locally. Look at it as a call to action. Look at it as essential context that underscores the importance of what you are doing here locally so we can sustain all of this forward progress until we get things sorted out in Washington. Okay, so that's my disclaimer. But I do want to start with a little bit of good news for all of us. We can pat ourselves on the back somewhat. I mentioned some of these things at the climate event Saturday night at College in Marin. In the period between 2005 and 2017, our greenhouse gas reduction emissions in this country went down fairly significantly, about 14% during that period. So that's good. That shows that we can actually bend the curve on greenhouse gas emissions. It shows that we do not inexorably have to keep increasing carbon pollution in order to grow the economy. Of course, one of the ways we did that was by substituting an awful lot of natural gas for coal. And that gets us into some of the bad news that goes along with the good news. Because during that same period, we saw an awful lot of new methane leakage emissions associated with all that natural gas production. And the other bad news that goes along with that is that our emissions, while they did go down during that period, in 2018 they're projected to be flat, and they're actually projected to go up a little bit in the next few years. So we have hit, we believe, peak emission for this country, even while the rest of the world continues to increase. That's good news. But in a sense, our emissions have begun to plateau, and it really underscores the importance of some of the things that the Obama administration was trying to put in place in order to achieve the rest of our commitment at the COP21 climate conference in Paris. If we stop here, we're on a path to be only about halfway to what we promised to do. So it's important that we understand the elements of how we were going to get the rest of the way. And of course, we need to go even further, as many of you heard Saturday night at College in Marin from Christian Figueres. The goal in hitting those COP21 goals was to actually set the stage for even more ambitious goals that we need to get rolling on in the next 2 years. So, the bad news, I'm getting into the bad news part of my remarks here, is that every one of the pillars that the Obama administration put in place to achieve the rest of those reductions and get us to our climate goals is under attack right now by the Trump administration. And I want to talk to you about what I see as some of the key fights in that regard. The biggest one, of course, is the Clean Power Plan. This was a goal focused on, obviously, the energy sector, to cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 32% below 2005 levels by the year 2030. It would, if it succeeded, it would have taken the equivalent of 75 million cars off the road, preventing more than 365 million metric tons of carbon dioxide from entering the atmosphere. It was a big part of how we were going to get the rest of the way to our target. In August of this year, the Trump administration released a proposed replacement plan for the Clean Power Plan. They call it the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. There are no quantitative limits in this new rule on greenhouse gas reduction. There are no timelines or deadlines or compliance consequences to this new rule. It requires states to consider establishing standards based on a very narrow and ineffective set of efficiency tweaks at power plants, and that's about it. There is evidence that this new rule, if it went into effect, would lead to about 1,400 premature deaths annually by 2030 due to particulate matter pollution increases, up to 15,000 new cases of upper respiratory problems, a rise in bronchitis, tens of thousands of missed school days, on and on. So it's pretty bad for the people of the United States, but the coal industry loves it. And under this plan, you won't be surprised to know, greenhouse gases actually go a lot higher than if we left the Clean Power Plan in place. By 2030, administration officials, Trump administration officials, are saying that the difference is minimal. They talk about the difference in the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere compared to the Clean Power Plan and this plan. But it's actually a big, big deal. And it's something that we're going to have to challenge. I'm challenging it in Congress. We're challenging it in the courts. The other piece of how we were going to get there is fuel economy standards. In 2010, we did something really important. Following leadership here in California, federal agencies working with the auto industry set a national standard that reflected California's clean car standard. And this put us on a path to achieve some very significant greenhouse gas reductions from both cars and light-duty trucks and also heavy-duty vehicles in the years ahead. In August of this year, the Trump administration released new proposed standards that freeze these phased-in higher fuel efficiency standards for the next several years and take away the ability of California and 12 other clean car states to set higher standards. This is something that we've always been allowed to do under the Clean Air Act. The Trump administration is proposing that we no longer have the authority to do that. Again, they're saying this won't make that much of a difference in terms of greenhouse gas reductions. It actually makes a huge difference. The difference between the efficiency standards that we were on course to achieve and what the Trump replacement plan would produce is the annual difference equivalent to the greenhouse gas reductions of the total greenhouse gas emissions of countries like Austria and Greece. That's the delta between these two plans. Now, you could argue that repealing the fuel economy standards in some ways is even more dangerous than the Clean Power Plan repeal, because states were actually making a lot of progress with power plant efficiencies. We were doing some good things already, but we haven't been able to do much on the transportation side without the leadership of California and these other clean car states. And so this is actually a big, big deal. We will be challenging it in court, but it's one of the huge, huge fights that we have right now. The other involves methane. I mentioned to you that the dark side of the greenhouse gas reduction we've achieved in the energy sector is that we have all this additional natural gas production, and with that comes a lot of methane leakage and pollution. So the Obama administration was taking some modest steps to do something about that, and in 2016, BLM and the Department of Interior published what they call the Waste Prevention Rule. This is to prevent emissions from flaring and venting and leaks on public land and Indian lands. And it was really a pretty modest rule. It basically followed what many states already had in place for oil and gas production on state land and on private land. It requires operators to inspect and repair their facilities, use best available technology, and this is the key, pay royalties on wasted gas. That makes sense, right? Because they're supposed to pay royalties on all the stuff they take out of our public land, and not just what they're able to sell to their customers at the end of that process. What a great incentive, by the way, for efficiency. It's actually good economics behind that rule, because the gas that they save through this leakage prevention incentive is gas they can turn around and sell to their customers and make money on. And as I said, it's basically the rule that's in place in many states around the United States already. The industry nevertheless challenged this. They went after it unsuccessfully in court, and now the Trump administration is taking action to undo it. They proposed a replacement rule that basically rolls us back to where we were before the waste prevention rule. We're going to challenge that in court. It's on, I think, flimsy legal ground because they haven't been able to provide a very good cost-benefit analysis for why we need to relax these standards, but it's a huge part of the fight. Then we have super pollutants, the hydrofluorocarbons, gases commonly found in air conditioners and refrigerators. The Obama administration finalized a rule in 2015 to phase these out. And this would have provided about 4% of our greenhouse gas reduction under the Paris commitment, according to Lawrence Berkeley Labs. Now, much of the industry is already moving towards cleaner alternatives to HFCs, but some in the industry challenged the rule in court. They took out some of the rule, but key parts of it survived. And then came Scott Pruitt in April of this year, announcing a rule that would basically take out the remaining parts of the HFC rule. He actually didn't do it by announcing a rule. He simply said he was going to stop enforcing the rule, which is a pretty suspect action under the Administrative Procedures Act. So that's going to be challenged in court as well. But like so many of these other things, you know, we're going to fight these things. I'm fighting them in Congress. We're fighting them in the courts, but we're losing time as we have to wage those fights. Another front for these fights back in Washington is the attempt to do what the science tells us we have to do. All the science says we've got to keep 80% of the known fossil fuel reserves in the ground if we're going to hold the climate to 2 degrees Celsius. We're nowhere close to that, but the Obama administration was at least beginning to take some meaningful steps along those lines. So you may be familiar with the fact that in 2016, Secretary Sally Jewell, the Department of Interior, put a moratorium on new coal leasing while we looked at these issues. There were lease plans on the West Coast and most of the Arctic Ocean and other parts of the Outer Continental Shelf that put some meaningful areas off limits to oil and gas production. In 2016, there were new safety rules put in place for offshore drilling to try to prevent disasters like the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf. And of course, there were decisions to deny the Keystone XL pipeline and to reopen environmental review on the Dakota Access Pipeline. So we were actually taking some steps, not enough, but some, to keep some of these fossil fuel reserves in the ground. The Trump administration started attacking all of this almost immediately with executive orders, undoing Keystone and Dakota Access, new policies announced to maximize energy production on public lands and on the Outer Continental Shelf, including the entire Arctic Ocean, suggesting that the entire Pacific and Atlantic Ocean would be open to new drilling, although you recall that Florida got a little special treatment from Secretary Zinke by way of a tweet after he started to get backlash from that. We still haven't heard their final decision on these leasing plans, but we have heard that they believe strongly that we need to have fossil fuel energy dominance on the Outer Continental Shelf and on our public lands. They have rolled back the safety regulations put in place after the Deepwater Horizon spill. BLM and the Department of Interior are expected to soon announce 2.9 million new acres for oil and gas leasing on public lands. The Forest Service has come out with new rules to make it easier to develop oil and gas in our national forests. So pretty much down the line, if you care about keeping fossil fuels in the ground, the Trump administration has taken us in the wrong direction. Then I'll just mention one other front, and that is the climate denial and censorship. This kind of goes to the institutional and cultural damage that the Trump administration is doing on this front. And Columbia Law School did an analysis kind of across the whole of government to look for censorship and other ways in which climate denial is taking effect. And they found over 100 instances of it. Just to name a few, you've read about some of these. In January 2017, Trump disbanded a federal climate advisory panel which had been created to help businesses and state and local governments understand and prepare for national climate assessments. In October 2017, EPA canceled talks by 3 scientists who were set to discuss climate change at a conference. November 2017, National Park Service staff were reprimanded for posting about climate change on Joshua Tree National Park's Twitter account. December 2017, Trump dropped climate change from a list of national security threats. It goes on, far too many examples of this for me to mention, but it's a truly corrosive part of the battle that we're fighting back in Washington. And the impact is that instead of facilitating the kind of leadership that all of you are demonstrating, the leadership we want to see from local governments and tribes and state governments, federal government is making it harder. They're revising their websites, they're burying data, they're pulling back grants for research and leadership in this front, and that's a serious problem. There have also been questionable reassignments of staff within government, and I am doing what I can in Congress to defend some of these whistleblowers, but I'm sure you've read about some of the high-profile reassignments of climate scientists to clerical jobs and so forth. Last piece of that I'll mention, the Obama administration had directed CEQ to develop guidelines for how we would consider climate impacts in NEPA analyses. This is pretty obvious. NEPA is supposed to require environmental reviews, the full range of environmental impacts for federal agency actions, and we We were litigating all over the place about how to properly incorporate climate impacts in NEPA analyses. The Obama administration was trying to do some rulemaking, provide guidance on how to get it right. The Trump administration has suspended that and essentially signaled that you don't have to consider climate impacts in NEPA analyses. They've also said you really don't have to think about that when you do flood risk standards and flood risk assessments. And if you want a good example of what that means, take a look at the Carolinas right now. Because just a few years ago, something similar happened in North Carolina, where instead of directing their authorities to consider the long-range impacts of sea level rise, they arbitrarily set, I believe, a 20-year horizon. Don't think about any sea level rise beyond 20 years. And so you're artificially constraining the horizon to make it a little easier to develop and put folks a little further at risk. Final piece of the fight that we're waging back in Washington is corruption. And I really can't underscore how closely related all the corruption that we see in this administration is to these climate challenges that we talk about. So many of our federal agencies have handed over the keys of government to the fossil fuel industry. And if you want one example that probably tells you everything you need to know. Remember the story about how Scott Pruitt was getting a sweetheart deal on an apartment from a D.C. lobbyist? A guy named Stephen Hart and his wife were cutting him a deal far better than anything you or I could get on an apartment in Washington. Well, turns out Stephen Hart was simultaneously lobbying the EPA to relax those super pollutant rules that I told you about a little while ago. He represents companies like Coca-Cola, who wanted to save money on their refrigeration costs. And so the corruption is part and parcel of the climate denial and these attempts to roll back all the progress that we were starting to make under the Obama administration. And that's the end of my good news. Look, I don't want to overwhelm you with all of this. We are fighting on all these fronts. And I hope you know that in many cases we have already prevented some of the worst impacts of these rollbacks. We have lawsuits pending. Some of them have been successful. We've been able to push back against requests by the Trump administration to zero out clean energy funding and other things that are important to maintain forward progress. So certainly it's not all bad. But the biggest problem I have to report from Washington is that all of these fights mean we're losing time. And to bring it back to what you're doing here, and what I hope, again, will be a call to action and not despair, it underscores the importance of all of you doing as much as you can right now, right here in our community. We are absolutely counting on you. I'll keep working to get things straightened out back in Washington, but in the meantime, I think one of the best things I can do is support and applaud the kind of leadership that I see right here in the North Bay community. I'm so proud to represent this place and all of you, and I appreciate you including me today.